learning, inspirational, and motivational content on the platform. I'm super excited to announce a new experience on CreativeLIve. It's called Fast Class. You've told us that you're busy and sometimes it's hard to dive into a full class from start to finish. So essentially, we're now giving you a shortened highlight version of our top CreativeLIve classes. You can always dive into the full class with 5, 10, or 15 hours of great content. But now, if you're just looking to focus on a few of the highlights or want to be able to skip quickly to something that really interests you, you can now get a shortened fast class version of that class. We're also thinking this might be able to help you explore a new craft and save time while doing it. This is a great tool to curate your learning experience to help create the life that you seek. So you're probably thinking, great, how do I access this new experience on CreativeLIve? That's easy. All you have to do is be a subscriber to the Creator Pass, and then all this is yours. If you're feeling isolated and looking for creative connection, try tuning into creativelive.com/TV. That's where we've got a 24/7 live stream from the kitchen counters.
I can do that backlit shot that I really like to do.
From the studios and living rooms of many of the world's top creators, where we're doing musical performances, Q&As, cooking shows, virtual book tour events, drawing, spoken word poetry, and more.
Life passed me by waiting for an invitation when the world is greater than my nation or my occupation. Be someone you've never been. You feel all that adrenaline, it's medicine.
It actually helps me feel like my days are more purposeful.
I hope that out of this deep pain will come some collective growth.
Dive into CreativeLIve TV today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to CreativeLIve. I'm Chase Jarvis, the founder of CreativeLIve and your host for the next 60 to 90 minutes. Very inspiring guest today. I can't wait to introduce her. But before we do, it's important that I welcome you to creativelive.com/TV, which is a channel that we released here during the pandemic, where we're going live into the homes and kitchen counters, the studios and the living rooms of the world's top creators and entrepreneurs. And this show is the Chase Jarvis Live show on CreativeLIve, where I sit down with the world's top creators and entrepreneurs with the goal of unpacking their brains to help you live your dreams in career and hobby and in life. My guest today is Angela Duckworth. She is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the founder and CEO of CharacterLab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She's a MacArthur genius. Her TED Talk's been viewed 20 million times. I mean, I realize this list is getting long. She's also the co-host of No Stupid Questions, a new podcast that she hosts with Stephen Dubner. And she is the best-selling author of the book Grit, which has had a tremendous impact on me as a creator and an entrepreneur. Grit is my favorite human characteristic outside of course of love, but love and grit is right next to it. That book has spent, I believe it's fair to say, hundreds of weeks between the hardback and the paperback on the New York Times list, sold millions of copies. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome the one and only inimitable Ms. Angela Duckworth to the show. Angela, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thanks for being here today. We had some chit chat before we started recording today. And speaking of chit chat, if you do want to participate in the chat, if you go to creativelive.com/TV, I'm seeing your questions and comments there. Or if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube Live, I will see those as well. So if you have questions or chats that you want me to forward or surface to Angela, I'd be happy to do so. Maybe you can start off by letting us know where you're calling in from. In the meantime, however, this idea of grit, as I opened with in your intro, is such a powerful concept in human performance. I believe I've listened to at least 100 videos of you talking about it. I wanted to start off for context for those who may be new to your work or not sure how you stumbled into the concept of grit. If you could tell us that story. I believe it evolved from you being a high school math teacher.
Yeah, before I was a high school math teacher, I was just a kid, and my dad was so obsessed with achievement that I think he probably endowed in me a lifelong interest in, who becomes really excellent at what they do. And so in a way, it's been a lifelong quest. And I was a high school math teacher for several years, and I found myself pretty frustrated, first with the kids, but then, of course, with myself, right? First, I was like, why aren't you learning what I'm teaching? And then I realized I should be frustrated. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, with the teacher, right? So I thought, why can't I motivate them to their potential? And I could see what they could do, but I couldn't get them there. And I became a psychological scientist to unpack a little bit, when somebody tries hard, why do they try hard? When they give up, why do they give up? Grit, I say, is the common denominator of high achievers, of those who are really excellent at what they do. And it's different from talent. So if talent is things coming easily to you and learning quickly, grit is really more about stamina. And I think it has two parts. It has perseverance, which is kind of the obvious part of grit, being resilient, hard worker, practicing, taking feedback. But also I think it's passion, loving what you do.
I'm fascinated by the intersection of those two things. And I too believe, and we at CreativeLIve believe, that that's the only way that you truly can unpack your dreams is by doing something that you care deeply about. I don't know if I've heard you talk expressly about this, about correctly identifying these areas. Is that an area of study for you? Because I think a lot of people say, oh, I like everything. I like everything from Legos to video games, and I like, football and golf. And how do I know what it is that I want? If I'm going to be gritty and persevere and have passion on it, how do I select these things? It's not, I think there's always a de facto, or most of the conversations I've heard you in, there's a de facto approach that we know what areas we're passionate about. And I'm wondering if that was an area of study or interest for you, because there's so many people listening right now. We're getting from, I see South Africa, I see Australia, these are the usuals, Canada, Mexico, New York, Tacoma, Washington. That's very different than Mexico. We're very focused. We got people from all over the world. That's the short end of the stick there, that are saying, help me understand this point. I want to know what I'm passionate about, and I haven't been given any tools to discover it. Just school and just my parents tell me to be good and
But good at what, right?
Exactly. Help us.
And it was a revelation to me, especially actually after the book came out, but to some extent before, because I already had data on this. Most people consider themselves higher in perseverance than in passion. And it's a little non-intuitive, because you would think that like working hard and being resilient, like that's the hard part of grit. The passion part sounds like it should be automatic. Like, how could you not know what you're interested in? But in fact, I think a lot of people don't know what they're interested in. And maybe it's more than that. I think it's that they haven't developed an interest. We use this word discover when we think about interest. Like maybe you can discover an interest in cooking or in photography. But I think develop is probably the better verb, because it turns out that human interests really take a long time to mature. And for example, example, you can't actually be totally in love with something when you're just a total beginner. As you develop expertise and background, you start to see the nuances, you start to see the complexity, and so it can take years really to develop an interest to the point where you would call it a passion. And you're exactly right, Chase. I think there needs to be more than your 8 classes that you take when you're in high school or the 4 classes that you take when you're in college. I think most people honestly do not develop their passions in those academic contexts. For most of us, it's time outside of the classroom.
Yeah, is that something, as a former teacher and now a psychologist, is there a prescription that you could offer for how to actually uncover that? Because so much emphasis put on school. I like to think that we're sold a map that says if you behave yourself when you grow up and you go to this school and you get these grades and then you go to this college, then you can have this career in this life. And I've always believed that we sell these maps because they're easy to print. But what we really ought to be selling is a compass, and that's how to attune yourself to what is true north to you. But I struggle, and I think so many people, we got some folks from the Philippines, from Norway, from Romania, also want to know, like, great, you acknowledge that that's not happening in school. Where is it happening?
Now
and as
what?
a psychologist, do you have a prescription for some folks how to endeavor that on their own?
So I do have some advice, and I actually taught a class called Grit Lab to undergraduates this last semester, and my undergraduates were dying to have a passion. Oh my gosh, they're already hardworking, but they were so thirsty for a direction. So my advice is to sample. And actually that term comes from researchers who say that before you specialize, for example, there's a study of NBA basketball players. They're obviously very good at what they do, but it turns out that those who sampled a large number of sports when they were younger are, and maybe this is a surprise to some, generally more successful in a lot of metrics, injuries, burnout, et cetera, more successful than those who specialize super early. And that, by the way, goes counter to a lot of parents' intuitions, like, oh my gosh, you're 4, like I'm gonna put you in this narrow track to be,
right,
whatever it is.
Professional violinist.
Yeah, for the rest of your life, don't fall behind. So I think sampling, as opposed to premature specialization, is the key. Now, I think I can be a little bit more specific than that, because it's like, okay, well, how do I sample? Here are two ideas. One is you can actually sample things without actually doing them if you're really not sure and you just want to get an idea. And you can do that through a curiosity conversation. That's the idea that Brian Grazer, the Hollywood producer, used when he was a young man to learn more about the world. And it can be a 10-minute conversation with somebody where you just really ask them, like, what do you do? What's a day in your life like? What do you love about your job? What do you hate about it? What do you know now that you didn't know? People love, by the way, to have these conversations with people who are, young and figuring themselves out. So you could sample that way, call up somebody who, is like you, is, doing work in, creative production. They could call me and ask me what it's like to be a professor. That's one way to sample. But I think more authentically, once you get your bearings, you have to actually do things. And one of the most common mistakes people make is that they think they can figure this out by like angsting about it, writing in their journal, talking. You have to, it's more like food. I mean, if you want to know what the durian fruit tastes like, there's only one way to really do it, and that is to taste the durian fruit.
I love it. In my book, I talk about action over intellect. We want to make the perfect set of decisions from the couch, so that no effort is wasted and that we're the most efficient with our time.
No mistakes.
And I just don't see that happening. I don't have any experience personally, and I don't see that. And yet, that is, measure twice, cut once. If I had 5 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening my axe. There's all these sort of like narratives in our culture, but none that can actually connect you directly with the passion or the feelings, the phenomenology, to use a philosophical word that I think you and I have
love that word, by the way.
shared around. And for those who don't know, that's the experience that you have or the feelings around your experience of reality until you do it. And
until you do it, you really can't predict. I mean, there's a guy named Roberto Diaz. He is an Emmy Award-winning violist. He is also the head of Curtis Music Academy. I think it's the most competitive music academy in the world. And he grew up to play the viola. Well, his parents played the violin and they were professional musicians, so that's not really a surprise. But here's the real story. When he was growing up, he also played the violin, and he was good, and I guess he liked it. But he liked soccer more, so he started playing soccer, and he thought, I'm going to become a professional soccer player. Well, that ended up not working out. And one day he picked up the viola, which, was just a little bit bigger than a violin. It's like you put a violin on a photocopier, you hit zoom, and like you get a viola. And he fell in love. And I asked him, like, how could you not predict that you would have liked the viola so much when you had so much experience with this other thing? And he was like, it's like the human voice. It has a different key. These are things I, of course, didn't understand. I'm not a musician, but you can't predict. I mean, you cannot predict. You have to try. And sometimes things that are so subtly different from other things that you don't like end up becoming passions for you. And I think that's why you have to get off the couch, get out in the world. It's very messy. It's also very inefficient. I mean, going and doing an internship for a summer that doesn't work out for you, feels like you're going about things the wrong way, but you're going about things exactly the right way when you do things like that.
Yeah, that part of, as I retrace your work, this idea of narrowing your focus, and you talk a lot about 100% focus, 100% effort, and I think you've made clear already in our conversation that that's not for a 4-year-old violinist or a 4-year-old athlete, that you need to sample a lot. But over time, what you've also said in your work is that you have to, a skill is you get to maintain or grow your proficiency if you use it or practice it. And yet for every door that we walk through, we've closed so many others behind us. And I realize, listening to the millions of people in our community that are creators and entrepreneurs, and the thought of choosing something to be great at or to master, is the language that I like to think about, is so traumatic and anxiety creating, because I'm going all in on the viola, but what if it was the violin that I was supposed to play?
Like serious FOMO, right?
Yeah, for sure. And these are in many ways, and whether you're spending money on college tuition or you're putting yourself out there, taking a risk in front of your friends and peers and teachers and career counselors, and God forbid your mentor that you find, you've done the internship, you got to work with fill in the blank person, and you figure out partway through you're not actually supposed to be doing that thing, and it was really something else, and you can't retrace that. So help us understand this, that you talk at length about focus, 100% effort, and also deciding what not to do, which is traumatic for a lot of folks.
I think it is traumatic. I think you put your finger right on it. This fear that you're getting second best or third best, and I think one of the like wrong things that we have in our head that I think prevents us from making more progress is that for a long time, for example, in my life, I also thought like I need to choose the perfect career, and it's all about choosing it. And once you choose it, it's like, it should be like in the movies, like great, like, and I have a calling and terrific. But I think these things are actually at least as much created than chosen. So for example, there is a possibility that I could have done something different than being a psychologist who studies excellence. Like maybe I could have, continued, I was pre-med. I mean, what would have happened to me if I had become a doctor? Like, I don't know, but it's possible that could also have been a great life. It's so much of what you do is creating, a great career, a great vocation, not just choosing. And, I'll give you one other analogy. I'm married and I love my husband, but I feel like our marriage is created as much as chosen, and it's work, and it's amazing, but it's not that like the whole job was just to choose the right person and like great, snap your fingers. If we understand that, I think it just relaxes us a little bit to say, look, take a little pressure off. You don't have to choose the singular one thing that you ought to have been. There's probably a set of things, and in that set, which could be quite wide, your job really is to create something that you love and can be loyal to.
That is a huge central tenet for my raison d'etre. Like that creativity is not popsicle sticks and glue and pipe cleaners that we're taught about in third grade. And it's not drawing a picture for the class on the chalkboard, but creativity with a capital C is like everything around us is created, including our lives. And this idea that application of effort, which to me is the segue that I'm trying to get back to your work, like how effort matters and how it's once you've chosen something, that the application of effort, and you talk about it very clearly. I'm hoping you can help unpack that a little bit for the folks that are new to your work and the relationship between, the concept of grit and the gap between, okay, I'm gritty, but what do you see? What are the characteristics that are predominant in world-class performers on any stage?
You know much more about Nietzsche than I do, given your background in philosophy. But one thing I very much love about Nietzsche was his trying to demystify genius, which of course he was considered being so precocious and so brilliant. But there are geniuses in philosophy, there are geniuses in music, there are geniuses in mathematics. And one of the things I think that is true of geniuses across all those fields is exactly what Nietzsche said, which is that there's the illusion that everything came easily to these people, that it's like a gift, like, songs just come into their head, the photographs come out beautifully. I remember when I was writing my book that you mentioned so generously, by the way, so thank you. When I was reading like at night, I would see these beautiful sentences, these really like perfect paragraphs. And I thought, wow, it must be really easy for everyone else. But for me, I'm just slogging through in front of my home computer. It was like Joyce Carol Oates has this quote that writing and rewriting is like pushing a peanut across a dirty kitchen floor with your nose. And this is the thing that
That's
we're
brilliant.
all doing that. And I think the illusion that Nietzsche wanted to sort of work against or, demystify is that things that are truly excellent come without effort. And it's not true. I have worked with really, really great writers and scientists, and you should see their first drafts, like humiliatingly bad. Right. And mine are too. So I think it's one of those things where in some ways it's obvious, but I think especially with people who are, on their journey, on their path, and they're not quite, at a level of excellence that they aspire to be, I think they often don't know that.
I love hearing that. And that is hopefully reassuring for a lot of folks who, wake up in the morning and look down at your feet on the floor and you're like, wait a minute, I'm not a genius.
Yeah, this is really hard for me.
Yeah, this is hard processing. And, that's one of the things that I found so reassuring about your work was that this effort, this focus and effort, and you've invoked a lot of different people as a lens through which to look at this. But given that we're creators and entrepreneurs and, is largely our audience that we're talking to today, let's hear a little bit about Will Smith. And you've eloquently spoken
crush?
about
his
career and just the effort. Again, a lot of people think, oh, genius, good at so many things. And, we'll get into the topic of mastery, because once you've mastered one thing, I think it's easier to apply it to others because you understand the ingredients. But for the examples that you've used with Will Smith, and for everyone who's watching and listening, Will Smith is you. I'm talking about you. I'm just using someone that everybody knows as a lens and asking Angela to share what is it about Will Smith that you uncovered through A, your crush, to use your word, and B, studying him and conversing with him that helped understand or excavate rather his genius.
Yeah, and I'm not just biased toward Will Smith because he's from Philadelphia. That's only part of it. No, he's really great. And by the way, when we say that we admire people like Will Smith, first of all, he's one of the few people who I think still has can hold his head up high in terms of character and being a really kind, honest person. One by one, our icons seem to fall these days, and Will Smith is pretty excellent as a human being. But as an artist, there's so much to admire. One of the things I admire so much about him is that he's not done. I mean, there is no resting on laurels, and that to me is what I think really inspires me about creative people. That there is a drive to create that is never sated. It's not about the money. It's not about the status. I don't even think it's about the praise or admiration. I did have, I don't want to sell myself as Will Smith's BFF, though I would love to be, but we have conversed. And I remember once he was telling me about, how a lot of people ask him, how do I become like you? How do I become, great at what I do? And he said, well, the thing is, like, what do you really want? And they, of course, say, like, oh, I want to be like you, I want to be excellent. And he was like, what you really want is, when the alarm goes off at 5 a.m, right? And you say you want this 6-pack, right? And 5 a.m, you turn off the alarm, you roll back into bed, you eventually get up, you have yourself a stack of pancakes. He's like, then you don't want it. And I think one of the things that really impresses me about Will and other people like you is that there's clarity of purpose. There isn't like all this conflicting, like, well, I sort of want this, but then again, I kind of want these other things. That there is, as Will Smith has said, a kind of aerodynamic alignment of goals, that things are not, there's not a huge amount of inner conflict. I want to get out of bed and exercise, and I want a 6-pack, but then again, I want to sleep late and I want these pancakes too. And it's not to say that you guys aren't complex or you're not human, but I do think there's such clarity of, what really matters to you, that in a way it blurs the line between work and play, that you're not feeling all the time that you are obligated to do what you do, but you want to do what you do. And I think that's why people like Will Smith can be not only great at what they do, but they can also be happy.
Let's explore that a little bit more, this interconnection between effort, doing the sort of the right thing, the thing you're designed for, the thing, as you said, you've created for yourself, and happiness. Have you uncovered anything in your studies on the topic?
I was actually trained as a PhD student by Marty Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology. So it was just the normal thing to do when you did a study to include happiness measures. And the most widely used measure in science for happiness is something called the life satisfaction scale. It's got 5 items, and they're basically of the gist of, like, overall, I'm satisfied with my life. And you give it a rating. And I find that when you measure happiness and grit, they go hand in hand. So if I could show you a graph, it would just be a diagonal line. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person who's gritty is at the top of the charts of happiness or vice versa, but it means there's a really clear trend. And it also means that these things aren't trade-offs necessarily. I think a lot of my life when I was really young, I thought, well, you could either be happy or you could be really great at what you do, but it would be hard to be both. And I think that's not right. I think it is possible to be great at what you do and also to feel like happy in your life in a holistic sense.
So this application of 100% effort in order to achieve world-class status, you've also framed this a little bit on 3 different curves. I heard a great talk from the Aspen Institute. I think you were speaking to a group of young people. And
teenagers.
Yeah, well, assuming we're teenagers, because I think we're all young at heart, and I like to share the idea that it's never too late to start down the path that you were meant to do, and discovering that is a core part of what you should be doing. I kind of think 2 things: find out what you're supposed to do and then do that thing. So if we think of ourselves just temporarily, for sake of this conversation, as teenagers, that audience that you were talking to at the Aspen Institute, what advice would you give us about these 3 different trajectories, and how would you coach us to be on what I think we'd all agree is the preferred trajectory towards world-class status in whatever area of discipline we choose?
So in that talk, I was trying to explain to this group of teenagers how human skills, like literally any human skill you can think of, how they develop. That could be, how to make a pie or roast a chicken. It could be how to write an essay or an op-ed for, a newspaper. It can be literally anything, even, being a friend or something else that you care about. So there are 3 paths, I think, and when you talk about human skill development, the path that I think everybody wants to be on is the path of continuous improvement, that if you follow the curve, it may be that, certain parts are steeper, certain parts are shallower, but the curve is going up, that you are getting better and better and better at writing, at making chickens, at being a friend, et cetera. The other paths are less desirable. One is that you plateau. And I think this actually happens to a lot of people. They get to be, a pretty decent teacher, or they get to be a pretty decent engineer, or artist. And there's a point in their development where they just keep doing the same thing that they were doing before. And that is comfortable. It's kind of automatic. But I think the tragedy of that path, the path of arrested development, is that you never see what you could have been. And the third path is quite common, especially among young people, and to some extent applies to sampling, which we were talking about, which is, say you start, playing the piano or learning how to paint watercolors or whatever it is that you begin. And then, you're like, not for me. And you put down that skill and you don't come back to it. Well, the brain is use it or lose it. So, you're not going to be able to maintain the same level of proficiency than when you started. So that curve goes down. So you have three choices. And of course, we just said, sampling is important because you might actually, find that watercolors aren't for you and you should be doing acrylics, or maybe you should be doing sculpture, or maybe you should be a dancer or whatever. But I do think that at some point, the most gratifying way to live is to find something where you are willing to keep learning forever, and to be playing the infinite game, and to never be done, even if the increments in your improvement are so small that only you can see them, right? And I think when you become truly world class, it may be that most of the world can't even tell that you've changed something, that you're growing, but you can tell. And I think that is, what a Will Smith represents to me. Somebody who is not done growing and developing as a creator.
Why do so? I'm using my very articulate pointer here. This our pointer. So there's the declination of skills. There's the world-class curve, and then to me, the curve that is actually most dangerous, because we have to turn our back on some things in order to be world-class, right? You can't be world-class at everything at the same time.
Right.
So take time, file time away a little bit, and just let's focus on the curves. To me, the most tragic and yet standard path is this path of arrested development.
Yeah, and I agree.
And my question to you, because so many people right now, I believe it's largely because they haven't chosen the right thing because of social programming and conditioning and expectations. I want to hear why you think so many people get stuck in arrested development. What's the why for this most traditional, again, categorized largely in our culture as safe and as wise and as like average? Why do we get stuck in that common curve that keeps us from greatness? And help us through this. This is the biggest pain point for people listening.
It is. And I agree with you. It does seem to be the standard path, super common, although in our view, maybe super tragic. Take driving, right? Like a lot of people there was a point where you didn't know how to drive and then you crawl up this learning curve. But for a lot of people, I don't think they would say I literally got better at driving last year, right? And so for a lot of parts of your life, you don't need to keep climbing up a learning curve. You don't need to be a better and better and better driver. For me, by the way, it's jogging. I am no better jogging, maybe even a little worse than I would, but that's okay. That's not my vocation. So I think being at this level of arrested development, which is just good enough, is fine for a lot of our life. I don't need to get better at doing laundry. I'm good enough. I might be able to get better, but I don't care. It's a wonderful thing to have something in your life, something, your vocation in your life where you're never done, where you're always eager to improve. And I think the reason why some people don't even have one thing where they're doing that is that it takes effort. So when you study people who are doing this kind of practice that we talked about, 100% effort, it's also very, very goal directed. So it's very conscious and deliberate. And then, of course, it requires feedback. And sometimes it's a lot of work to even get that feedback. You might ask people, how can I make this, broadcast more effective for you? What can I do better as an interviewer? Whatever it is that you're doing,
Are these hints for me?
Well, no, what I would say is that when I started, having conversations or doing talks, I used to not ask for feedback. Then one day, I realized that, like, in my talk, I talk about like getting feedback. And so actually, quite literally, I will email you, Chase, and I'm going to ask you what's one thing I could have done better during this conversation. And that is effort. And also, by the way, the ego gets in the way. So there are lots of reasons why we might not choose this path of continuous improvement. It's very effortful. It requires having an ego that says, like, I'm going to not only accept when people tell me that I could have done better, I'm going to ask people to tell me how I could do better. And when you kind of, start to tally up all those things, you're like, oh, well, essentially being on that plateau of arrested development is like basically being on your couch watching Netflix, and it's easy and comfortable. And that's, I think, why so many people stay there.
Easy and comfortable is not the path to greatness.
It's not how you've chosen to live your life.
Well, let's go into this goal alignment, and I want to acknowledge a question coming in from Be Fluid Productions from our YouTube live right now, and it's this. You mentioned aerodynamic alignment of goals. That was a Will Smith line, I think. But what is that? And when I hear people set goals, I hear often very, very vague goals, like I want to get better at, or I want to put more money in the bank to create security for my family, or it's just these are vagaries. And yeah. I'm curious if you could go, if not experiencing that curve of arrested development, if we want to put ourselves on this highest performing path towards world class, let's just take for granted that we've identified something, knowing, as we acknowledged earlier, what a challenge that is culturally, because you're saying no to your career counselor and your parents and your grandma and your spouse and your partner, what's good for you. You make that decision. Now, talk about the aerodynamic alignment of goals.
So people all have goals, but the key is, are your goals organized in a hierarchy that is aligned? Now, what do I mean by hierarchy? Imagine a pyramid of goals where there's a top level goal that is your purpose, what you're all about, your identity. And it's so core to who you are. It's so linked to your personal values that you can imagine going to your deathbed with that purpose. And for me, it's pretty specific. And it took me, a while to actually figure it out, but is use psychological science to help kids thrive. And I really think about that as guiding every decision that I make, including being on your show, because I think, well, there's got to be people out there who, care about and know a kid in their life. So that's a top level goal. But the hierarchy comes from, well, how are you going to do that? Well, be a scientist, also be a communicator. Well, how are you going to be a scientist? Well, here are 4 projects that I'm working on. Okay, let's take one of those projects. Like, what's the next thing that needs to happen? Well, I have to write an outline. This is a hierarchy of goals from the most abstract and ethereal to the most specific, concrete, and short term. And I think when people like Will Smith talk about aerodynamic goals, or I think, he's way more articulate than I am. So I think he said harmony is aerodynamic. When your goals are in harmony, there's a kind of, like there's no friction, right? Like you're just going. I think that's the key. And so I think for us, practically speaking, when you talk to someone and they have this like vague goal, it doesn't really, it may be that they don't have like a set of concrete specific actions, like sub goals that make that, real. It also may be a little untethered to their highest level goals, right? And I think if people could, just as an exercise, right, get out a piece of paper and start to just sketch out in pencil, not in pen, right? Just like things that you want, and see if you can make a kind of rough hierarchy, and see if toward the top you could say like, yeah, these are my enduring personal values. And at the very bottom, this is my concrete to-do list for next week, and see if these things align. If they don't align, I think that might be why, you're not getting anywhere, because you're deeply conflicted, as opposed to, experiencing the harmony that, somebody like Will Smith experiences.
Very well articulated. I will offer another suggestion to those who are doing that exercise right now, which is look at how you spend your time. if you do an analysis on your schedule, this has been a recurring theme for me. I want this, and then you look at how you spend your time and you realize that it's so fragmented and not aligned in the Will Smith's sense. Same with what you spend your money on. If you spend your money on one thing and your goal is a different thing, I think those two lenses also help. But I love the idea of not putting so much pressure on it. Like auditing your calendar takes effort. Looking at your bank account and credit card statements take effort. Making a list of things that what is your to-do list and what is your goal, and seeing if the thing that you're supposed to be doing over the next week, the list of to-dos that we have around the house and the rest of our life, does it align? That's it's a good lens. And we've got questions coming in from Daniel Tibbetts. I see Marina, Mike, Susie, Ridwana, Chris. Thanks all for I just want you to know that I'm seeing you, and I've got a couple of other topics I want to cover with Angela, and then we'll get into some of your questions. I just want you to know that I'm seeing them. So Angela, you talk in depth about this application of 100% effort. How many people do you feel like in your experience as a math teacher, your experience as a psychologist, studying West Point, studying 100% effort seems like 100 out of 100 that's a lot of effort, right? And
it's a lot.
And if that's required for greatness and fulfillment, because I think those two things are important to pair to one another, what do you see on average? Is that a characteristic that most people have? Is it a characteristic? Is it something that you can develop? Is it something that you uncover? Because the thought of 100% effort on your push-ups or on your abs, to use the analogy you used earlier or the narrative around pancakes,
Right.
like, does it literally require 100% effort? Because that's a big number, 100 out of 100.
Yeah, just as you're saying that, I see how intimidating that is. And how about this? The more, the better. And the closer to 100%, the better. And by the way, if the people who are listening and watching could just think for a moment, if there's ever been a time in your life where you really were 100% concentrated on what you were doing, like completely absorbed. By the way, I think a lot of people would say that this is the flow state, right? 100% voluntary attention. And, some people will, I remember I asked Brian Grazer that question, actually, speaking of the curiosity conversation guru and Hollywood producer, very creative. And he said, actually, it surprised me. I thought he was going to say something about, being in a film studio, but he said when he's surfing, that is 100% concentration. And I think a lot of people experience this when they're rock climbing or they're doing something, frankly, where physically, if they're not concentrating 100%, it's like your body makes you concentrate 100%. I ask you to do that exercise only because you realize that there are times in your life where you've been that undistracted. And for most people, it's a euphoric state to be completely engaged.
It's flow, right? It's flow.
Yeah, and man, it's hard to beat flow, right? So I do think people can learn to experience this more. They can learn to direct their attention more. Part of this is trivial, right? If you want to have 100% concentration and you find it difficult, well, you have to, for example, and this is appropriate given that we're all in a pandemic right now, that you physically be somewhere that there are as few distractions as possible, right? So if you have like a pinging cell phone and your monitors up and you're in a place where like people are walking by all the time, then it is very hard to achieve that kind of concentration. So if you want to get closer to 100%, you can start to hack your physical space and say, look, between 10 and 12, everyone out of the kitchen, right? Like I'm writing in my journal, I'm working on this book chapter, like I need to concentrate. That doesn't mean your mind's not going to wander. It doesn't mean you're going to be like, oh, I wonder what's in the refrigerator. But you're kind of setting yourself up for that kind of flow state in a way that you're using your environment to your advantage.
I love that there's an intention behind it that I think a lot of if there's a gap between world-class performance and what people think world-class performance is, maybe that's one of the things, this 100% effort. I'm fascinated by the idea that it can be outside of your area, that what you're really training is focus, and focus the on. Of course, you should spend as much time as you can focusing on the area of mastery, but that you're pursuing, but that you're actually conditioning that you can have 100% of focus in other areas. Also, I was curious about, let's see, there's a thread that I wanted to pull on here, and it's, well, let me go a different direction. I want to go down this focusing, or having the ability to do lots of different things, and then have that apply, the lessons that you apply be relevant to what you're doing. Because if someone likes to, play the violin, but they're really trying to be a world-class neuroscientist, how can those, how do those things relate? And I'm curious from, I know you're educated in neurobiology, which I think a lot of this probably has neural pathways at play, and just wondering if you can get a little bit more into the science for us about applying 100% in everything, or in anything that you do, is actually contributes to the area of mastery.
So just on the point of, how can you be like devoted to something, but you might have other interests, and, how do you make that work for you? Like, you might be really, for me, I'll just make it personal. Like, I'm really into psychology. It's what I do. I will definitely go to my deathbed doing it, but I actually love to cook. And there was a very brief moment in time where I thought I might, try to have a restaurant someday and be a chef, right? So what do I do with those? Well, by the way, it is possible to just live a very happy life where, like, you have a vocation and you have a hobby on the side, an avocation, and they're not connected at all. But it's especially fun when they can be connected. And so how do I connect cooking with my career as a psychological scientist? Well, sometimes really trivial ways. Like, I used to bake for the students in my undergraduate class. That was nice. When we were actually meeting in person. Try out like different banana bread recipes. But sometimes it can be even deeper than that. So for example, when I was writing my book, I thought, I'm going to interview chefs for no other reason than I love cooking and chefs and restaurants. So I'm going to study the psychology of excellence through the lens of award-winning James Beard chefs. Now, that is the kind of thing that I do think, what interest really is. Like, if we've all experienced interest, but we've all also been bored. And if you do a little bit of introspection about, boredom, it's kind of the opposite of the flow state, right? Like, your mind is like a caged animal. You're so bored. You want to, find some way to stimulate yourself. It's like, I don't want to be here right now. Whereas the flow state is like, I am completely voluntarily absorbed. And one of the reasons I love grit is that when you really have a passion, if you're a photographer, like, you probably see everything, and everything that experience, nothing's boring, because, everything you're sort of understanding it as a photographer would, as visual imagery and contrast and beauty. A psychologist, dude, you will never be bored if you're a psychologist, because everything has a psychological dimension. The politics in this country have a psychological dimension. When I go to Starbucks, it has a psychological dimension. So I think that one of the great things about being a really gritty, passionate person is that nothing becomes boring, because whatever it is, there's always some connection, like some lateral connection or some angle that ties you back to the thing that you so deeply care about. And that makes your life infinitely interesting. And really, without exaggeration, like never boring. And when you ask me about the neurobiology side of this, I'll just say that, I think it's probably premature for me to say things like, oh, this lights up, or this is but it is definitely true that when we have an idea, what happens in our brain is that a certain network will light up. Like, I'll say a word and I'll light it up for you. Apple. Okay, in your brain, apple lit up. And then certain other things that you have associated with apple, like apple pie, or like you bring your teacher an apple, or maybe a painting of an apple, or the Yoko Ono apple with, that she gave to John Lennon. I think that was her first painting that he, met her through. So all those associations just start to like be activated. And so it is a wonderful thing that when you have kind of a through line, so like everything is psychology, but then all these little, associations are kind of, pulled in. So you're not as narrow really as you think. And I'll just end with this on this question, which is I really like David Epstein's book, Range. And in some ways you could think of it as like very contra grit, but I think actually ultimately, and we had a conversation about this, I think we agree. There is something about depth, which is very special, but it doesn't mean there's no breadth. It means, of course, you have to sample. And also there is this cross-fertilization that happens, which is amazing to have happen when you're a real expert.
I love looking at that through the lens of mastery. I love once you've mastered something, the ability to master other things becomes easier because you understand the ingredients and how they intermix. And certainly they're going to be different in a different area of expertise. I think, that depth part is fascinating. Also through the lens of community. Like if I identify as a photographer or someone listening right now identifies as an entrepreneur, and for me, it was action sports, but part of what I learned about action sports was there's this area of psychology, like how did Alex Honnold climb the one of the most harrowing routes
Is it El Capitan? I always forget that.
Yeah. But with no ropes, like there's a psychological aspect. And as someone who I didn't, my friend Jimmy Chin, who's also been on the show, directed that, but what the psychology of and this is like an adjacent thread that I got really excited and interested about, because lo and behold, that is, the ability to focus on something, the ability to be 100% involved in the project, the effort, the commitment, all of those things has super broad application. So I'm with you. I don't see a contrast between range and grit. I think there's this a through thread. This is maybe a slight departure, but I believe, and I think this I've shared a lot with this community about nothing happens in a vacuum, and everything, even if it's perceived as an individual success, it's a team and it's a community. And so I advocate for building community, but I want to juxtapose, and I want to understand how you feel about it, because you talked about I think it was around basketball, when you looked at some of the world's top basketball players, they spent, I think, some disproportionate amount of time, the highest level of effort was when they were alone, despite it being a team sport. So I'm curious about if instead of like individual contributor to team, can you talk about this idea of, if you believe, as I do, that a community is an important part of success and cultivating that, but the most effort is when we're alone.
Yeah, there seems to be a tension or maybe even a paradox there. So I was probably referring to the research of Anders Ericsson, who actually is the scientist behind this whole idea of deliberate practice and thousands and thousands of hours of practice to become an expert. Anders Ericsson has found in his research of world-class performers in every imaginable domain, right, whether it's mental or physical, that there is this, key, which is, complete focus, or as close to 100% as you can get. And one of the things that he has noticed, and we've studied together because we collaborate, is that this tends to happen when people are alone versus in groups. So let's take musicians, for example. You could practice, like, for example, if you're in a quartet, like, wouldn't you practice with the other three people? And of course, quartets do practice together, but a lot of time when you're learning your piece for the quartet, you practice alone. Well, why would you do that? It just turns out, I think, that in that time when you're alone, you can really concentrate in ways that are, I think, very difficult when there's like other people around who are like talking to you, or, want your attention, or, we're all social creatures. So when there's another person in the room, I hope we're paying attention to them. And that means we're not necessarily paying attention to what we're practicing. But I don't want people to take that as, to be a gritty, excellent person, you have to be a loner, because it's exactly what you said, Jesus. It's the opposite. I mean, being great at anything is always a team sport in some sense. So how does this all, square with each other? I think it means that for periods of the day, it may be that you need to be alone. So just so you can concentrate, not that you hate people, but just so you can really completely concentrate on your writing, on your, practicing a speech, whatever it is, practicing a basketball move. And then, of course, if for a lot of people, they have to integrate that into some team play, like you're a basketball player or you're, an executive and you're an entrepreneur and you have to get your team on board. But more than that, I think, the idea to one of the things that I study less, but it's totally true. It's just not grit, but there are other things you need to be successful is like, I think most of the people that I've studied have been remarkable at developing authentic relationships with other people. I'm not saying they're manipulative. They're genuinely interested in other people, in being helpful, and they're empathic. So, when I featured Mark Vetri as a chef in my book, because I love food, I found him because I asked the food writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who's the grittiest chef in Philadelphia. They said, go talk to Mark. So turns out he's very gritty. He does all the things that I study. But I got to know him a little better since then. And I am equally struck by how this guy is so profoundly embedded in a network of other chefs, of other entrepreneurs, of the guy around the corner that he, smokes cigar with. It's those kinds of social connections. That's not grit, but maybe you can call it social intelligence. So it's not just grit that makes you successful.
Love it. Love it. I want to go to a question that has come in from Daniel. This is a little bit of a precursor, a couple of comments about creativity and feeling, but ultimately what he wants to know, which I think is a great question, is how does your anticipation or your expectations affect the quality of your performance, your emotions, and ultimately even mental health? How do expectations play into this character, to frame it in your world, this element of grit?
Profoundly important question. Let's take two diametrically opposed expectations. You could be an optimist or pessimist, right? Optimists might, be experiencing this pandemic and think well, it's terrible, but gosh, I learned all these things. I learned all these features on Zoom that I didn't know existed. And I, learned how to cook better. I learned how to bake bread. I learned how to figure out a schedule to my day because I had to create one. And, the usual landmarks of leave for work, come back from work, we're gone. Wow, look at what I learned. And look at all the things that I have agency over that I could control. A pessimist might have different expectancies this is going to go on forever. Nobody knows, we're all going to fight with each other till really nothing gets done. I think these two different expectant kind of, different ways of thinking about both the past and the future are in some ways self-fulfilling prophecies. Because if you have that optimistic outlook, always hunting for something that you can do, something that, is going well, then in fact, you will actually find things that you can do. And, you will, by the way, be drawing other people to you because turns out people don't really like to hang out with sad, pessimistic people. But the pessimists are also going to prove themselves right? They'll I bet this is going to go terribly. I bet there's nothing I can do. See, it did go terribly. So I think there's so much power in this. And, some of the people who study therapy, which I'm a big fan of, psychotherapy, one of the great inventions in the last 100 years, is so much of it is trying to help people create positive and accurate expectancies and to get out of, distorted and maladaptive pessimistic expectancies because you do have this power to fulfill those prophecies in a way.
I think so much of this probably has a foundation in Carol Dweck's work with mindset. I'm wondering if you could put grit and mindset together and talk about those two things. I think that the mindset, my belief is I like to think of that as the base of any pyramid that you get a foundation of. I'm curious, is mindset a piece of grit? How do you what's the relation between those two things?
I know that some people might be sick of growth mindset, but I love it. And I think it is so important. What is a growth mindset? Carol Dweck at Stanford University, probably more than anyone, my role model, my hero, she defines a growth mindset as a belief, a conviction that your abilities can change, as opposed to a fixed mindset, which is the conviction that you really can't change anything about yourself in any fundamental way. And the relationship between grit and growth mindset, I first discovered in a research study that Carol and I were both, helping to lead. And we were looking at teenagers, and we just measured grit using my grit questionnaire. It's called the grit scale. We measured growth mindset using her measure, and there was a correlation. Since then, I've done longitudinal research where I come back again and again and again to the same population, and I measure grit and growth mindset. And here's what I find. There's a virtuous cycle where the grittier you are at time one, the more likely you are to develop a growth mindset at time two. The more you develop a growth mindset at time two, the more likely you're to grow in grit at time three, and so on. And so I feel like when you believe that you can change, when you kind of have that as a fundamental core belief, that leads you to try things, to work hard, to be a little more resilient versus a little more fragile, to throw yourselves into things. That affirms that belief that fundamentally human nature is malleable. And that would be the virtuous path that I think, no matter how old you are, it's never too late to get on. And it's much better, I think, than the opposite path, which is, fixed mindset, don't try, never go out of your house, don't get off the couch. And then you get into that, more pessimistic spiral.
Amazing. It's easy to see why grit is spent, I don't know how many hundreds of weeks on the New York Times list, because it's so infectious. The concept, it has this element of psychology, an element of physicality and effort. It's, both alone and team. It's so dynamic. Did you stumble on that afterwards? Were you obsessed with grit before you uncovered all its components, or was it the other way around?
Well, I started studying grit in my very first year of graduate school, but I didn't always call it that. My professor, Marty Seligman, at one point early in our research on grit, but as I said, it was in my first year. It was after I had already collected some data. He really wanted me to name it, and I was like, well, what do I call this combination of passion and perseverance? And I don't know, Marty. Maybe it doesn't matter. Why don't we just think about the name later? But he was pretty stubborn. He was like, no, I'm not going to talk to you until you have a name for it. So I took out a legal pad and I just started writing names like stamina, and anyway, I got to grit and that stuck. So I'd say I was studying grit from the very beginning of my career as a psychological scientist. The name came pretty early on. I think, though, I've continued to understand it better and see how it's connected in ways to things like growth mindset, to having a higher level purpose, like a sense of meaning in life, connecting it to the science of flow, connecting it to the science of deliberate practice. So I'm definitely learning, and I know it's not the only thing you need to be successful, but I do stand by my first convictions that it is a common denominator. I mean, people who are really great, let's not make the mistake to assume that it was all talent. I really don't think it is. I think there's almost always this huge amount of passion and perseverance, a huge amount of consistency, right? All the things that we talked about in this conversation, the key would be like, can you do these things? Can you bring them out in yourself in a consistent way over a long period of time? That's what will lead you to excellence.
That perseverance part, I was going to circle back, because we talked a lot about passion and application of effort, but doing so over a long period of time. And I think you say that's why choosing something that you like in order to be world-class at is important, because that is actually one of the key determining factors. Would you add anything else on perseverance? I think that's part of the part that is hard and people overlook. And I don't want to do that in this conversation. It's really important.
I met a guy named George recently. He wants to understand his own tiger parents. And I want to bring that up because, there is something to avoid, I think. If you want to be gritty and great, don't don't think that that comes through like extrinsic motivation, and don't parents think that you can force your kids to be gritty and passionate about something that you chose for them. It doesn't work that way. You can't be like, you're going to be pre-med and play the violin and you're going to be great at it, because it's exactly what you say. Well, it takes so much consistency and takes so long that people just can't sustain that amount of consistent effort in a wholehearted way. And by the way, that really does lead to unhappiness. And there's lots of research on when people pursue goals that they feel have been kind of externally imposed on them as opposed to voluntarily chosen. Yeah, they can do it. They can do it for an hour. They can do it for a week. Some people can even do it for longer, but it makes them very, very unhappy. So I think the route that people need to try to follow is to, sample and figure out things. I know it's messy. I know it takes longer than you would like. But the fruit of that will be that you can develop an interest and a passion that is yours, and not imposed on you by anybody else.
That is going to be the clip out that we are going to share far and wide from this. That is so important. And I got two questions. I know we're coming up on time, and I want to be respectful of what we've carved out for this today. Two things. One, not just 10,000 hours, and whether you attribute that Anders/Gladwell, the 10,000 hours of effort, this idea that you have championed of deliberate practice and it being actually the hardest and the worst and the most painful kind of practice. Can you relate that back to this choosing of what it is that you want to create for yourself? This idea of deliberate practice, not just 10,000 hours like digging a ditch, but 10,000 hours of doing the hard stuff, this deliberate practice, not just going through the motions. How does that relate to this choice that we are ultimately making for ourselves?
There seems to be a contradiction, right? Like, wait, are you saying that you're going to love it? Or are you saying that you're going to hate it, right? Like, are you
this
saying
is why I'm asking.
Yeah, like, is it voluntary? You're going to have to force yourself to do hard things. So I remember interviewing Olympic gold medalist swimmer Rowdy Gaines for my book. And I asked him this question because, man, when he described what it's like to train for, the freestyle, in the Olympics and, getting up at God knows when, 4 a.m, putting on a Speedo, jumping in a cold pool and really pushing yourself till you want to vomit, or when you do vomit, every day, after, that sounds terrible, right? But he kept using these words like, I love this sport. I always loved it. I love what I do. So there is something of a kind of apparent tension there. Here's how I think it resolves. There are no great people who don't have some component of what they do that they probably do, but it's not the funnest thing in the moment. It's not the easiest thing, but because they overall love everything. I mean, frankly, I've got 17 and 18-year-old daughters. I mean, do I love them? I love nothing more in this world than I love my kids. Is it easy? Hell no. Right? I mean, there's so many things I do where I'm like, oh my God, I want to claw up my eyeballs, or, I'm crying, they're crying. So part of this paradox is resolved when you understand, when you love the totality of what you do. And this is what Rowdy explained to me. When you love the totality of it, it does mean that there are parts that are really hard, that make you cry, that you do anyway because you love the totality. So that's one resolution. And here's the Yoda Obi-Wan Kenobi stage. I have not yet gotten to the true Jedi stage. There are some truly great people that I've studied that they say that when you reach a certain state of enlightenment, that even the hardest things become flow. And those people, like Josh Waitzkin, world-class chess player, world-class, martial artist. He says that when you reach a certain stage of understanding, that the phenomenology, as you said, actually shifts a bit, and what was effortful doesn't feel as effortful. I have not yet achieved the state of enlightenment, but I understand the Rowdy Gaines point, and I do think that when you choose this path, you're not choosing it because it's easy. And you're not choosing it because it's comfortable, and nevertheless, you're choosing it.
Amazing. Speed round, 3 questions, then we're going to let you go. Giant wants to know, explain with help of an example the best way to cultivate good habits from scratch.
The best thing you can do to cultivate a habit is identify the action that you want to be able to do on autopilot. That's the habit. Identify a cue, like a physical thing that's going to cue you, right? 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or every time I see this big red poster on my wall, et cetera. So that's the cue. And then the last thing is to make a habit. You have to make it immediately rewarding. So people don't develop habits when there's a cue and they do the thing over and over again, but there's no reward. So you have to, for example, use self-talk, like praise yourself every time you do that thing, or get someone else to praise you, or do something else that's immediately rewarding. That's how you develop a habit.
Amazing. We're going to put application of your concepts to work here. In this question, Michael Harris wants to know, I'm a photographer, but I went to grad school for social work. I'm really interested in people, a lot of things you're talking about. I have multiple goals. Is this okay?
I think it's totally okay. You might want to consider this, right? If you want to, when you want to, you might want to like put those goals out on a piece of paper and see whether there's some way to tie them together, or more than one of them anyway together. Maybe you can't tie all of them in one bundle.
Is that like grit and chefs? Is that
Yeah, or for me, something I didn't mention to you, Chase, was like I really love writing. I love words, and I think for me, like I love writing, I love science, and I do a lot of writing about science. So, there are other ways. That's why I said, like, you might not be able to tie everything in a nice little bow, but see if you can get more of your loves to go together, because that is, as Will Smith would say, more aerodynamic.
Last question from the audience is from Chris Ainsley. Practical strategies for moving from fixed to growth mindset.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do what Carol does in her own interventions, which is this. I'm going to just tell you, the brain is plastic. Carol Dweck is right. The brain is never stopped in its growth and development. It used to be 50 years ago, people thought, oh, after childhood, the brain is fixed. But it turns out there's never a day in your life where your brain isn't changing and growing. So maybe knowing that scientific fact will help you understand that when you try something hard and you make a mistake and it feels bad, your brain is growing.
Thanks for that little lightning round there. If you have not read Grit and you're listening or watching right now, this is an absolute must, one of the most impactful books of my professional development. And I want to say thank you so much for being on the show. I also need to direct people to No Stupid Questions, the podcast that you do with Stephen Dubner, which is just a delight. Congratulations. Just came out, like a week ago?
I think so. Like I think it's just out. Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations. Anywhere you'd like to steer the people watching and listening, this is going to be around for a long time. This is a classic. So
you have a huge audience, right? So remember my top level goal. If you are a parent or somebody who works with kids, then go to characterlab.org, where you can get actionable advice on how kids thrive from, among others, me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
It was so much fun.
So much knowledge, just like emanating, and I'm seeing notes. I've got a 3 pages of notes here in my notebook. I got just people calling in from all over the world saying thank you for sharing with us. It's been a treat to have you on the show. I'm a huge fan, and I'll hope to have you back at some point in the future, because I know you'll keep putting out great stuff. So thank you so much.
I had a ball. Thank you. That was great.